Just doing a little quick check here, and looks like I might need to move a little bit this way so everybody on radio land can actually see me. Good morning, everybody. My name is Colin Corcoran. I'm the CEO of the Community Sector Council in Newfoundland, Labrador, and I like to say that's my my second job. My first job is as a father of 3 young girls. Girls who are currently sick right now. So if I disappear midway through the presentation today, it's because I received a phone call from daycare or otherwise, and I have to leave. But these are the dualistic relationships we have with our roles. And many of us are social entrepreneurs, a hat that we wear freely and a hat that means something very important. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about social enterprise structuring. And before we begin, something I'd really like to do is kind of same page us with a little bit of a quote. And this one spoke to me in particular as preparing for this presentation. Virgil, a Roman, once famously said, "Fortune favors the bold." As we continue to cascade into what social enterprise looks like in this country, in this province, in our communities, in our own organizations, my daring challenge to you all is to be bold, be daring, because if we collectively attempt to challenge the status quo, and if we collectively attempt to do things that are a little off the beaten track, we'll pave that pathway for many of us in the future. So today I'm going to really focus on the structure of social enterprise, provide you with tangible, tactical tips and tricks as you're thinking about how to structure social enterprise moving forward. So I'm going to begin with what is social enterprise, the quintessential question that hasn't really been answered. What I'll do is I'll define a little bit what social enterprise looks like. I'll talk about the continuum to kind of get us into a frame of mind. And then let's have an agreement of what these terms actually mean at the end of the day. Then we'll get into some social enterprise structuring. This is where I'll get into some legal corporate structures and what that means for each social enterprise and potential social enterprise. Then we'll discuss the relationships of those and, of course, some rules of thumb to remember all along the way. In addition, what we're going to do is talk about a couple strategies for success, a few things that I want you folks to keep in mind as you're continuing your collective journeys. So today, this is admittedly a little bit dry material. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to jazz it up wherever I can. You're going to get the authentic Colin here this morning, and I encourage you to pop any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll leave some time otherwise midway through or at the end of our conversation to dive into those questions. So get your caffeine ready and let's go on a ride. So what is a social enterprise? Well, there's a couple definitions. So when we're thinking about what is a social enterprise, the closest to a dictionary definition is from Cambridge Dictionary. Social enterprise is an organization that aims to make money in order to serve a social purpose. Well, that makes sense. You aim to make revenue. You aim to sell a good or service in order to do some good in the world. A social enterprise is the activity of running organizations that aim to make money in order to serve useful social purposes. So it's the activity of actually partaking and running those organizations. The definition is lacking though. Who is the organization? How do we define that organization? And what is the intent at the end of the day? So we zoom over to Buy Social Canada, a national organization that has been supporting social procurement in our country. And they define social enterprise as businesses that sell goods or services, embedded a social, cultural, or environmental purpose into the business, and reinvest a majority of profits or surplus into their purpose. There's some challenges with this. It takes social enterprise from the for-profit perspective, from a business perspective. And it actually boxes us into a definition around social, cultural, and environmental purposes. What about community purposes? What about the common good? And reinvest the majority? How do we define the majority? Who sets what that majority is? So Dr. Gregory Dees, who set the trajectory of defining what social enterprise really means in an academic sense, really poetically says, it combines the heart of a nonprofit with the mind of a business, using market-based approaches to create social value. Again, a very grounding term for a social enterprise. The challenge is the heart of a nonprofit. What is the heart of a nonprofit? What is that why statement? The mind of a business. What does this mean in practicality? And what are market-based approaches? So across these various definitions, and more definitions even so, there is not a general definition of what a social enterprise is. Because at the end of the day, social enterprise is a definition. We can go on and on with others like the Social Enterprise World Forum that tries to expand upon it. But at the end of the day, when we're trying to set a definition or write a box around something that is not well defined, at the end of the day, defining a social enterprise is bullshit. And forgive me for that language, but we honestly can't actually define it. Social enterprise doesn't exist as a legal corporate structure. Social enterprise doesn't exist as a pure business strategy. Social enterprise doesn't exist as a taxable entity. And so our challenge here today, when we're thinking about structuring, is actually defining what a social enterprise is. So we define it by what it's not. It's not a legal structure. We know that. There is no legislation that currently provides for social enterprises in our nation. It is not a corporate entity. We cannot file with CRA as a social enterprise, and is not universally defined. So how do we define it? It is an intention. Social entrepreneurship is an intention to do good and be well. Social enterprise is intention to leverage business practices, revenue-seeking methodologies, market-based approaches in order to achieve a good at the end of the day. And that's how we're going to have to think about social enterprise. So one of the challenges that I've always had, and we talk about, is a little bit what I call the business method continuum. And this continuum, if you look on the very far left of continuum, you have nonprofit structures. You have charities and nonprofits. Those are well-defined and understood. Then you have diversified nonprofits, which is what I would call nonprofits that have diversified revenue streams. It could include a little bit of social enterprising work, like selling tickets. It could include new fundraising or corporate sponsorship, but the intention is not there. The intention is not there. Then we move into what I would call an enterprising nonprofit. This is essentially a nonprofit organization that has adopted business practices. And then when we leap on the other side of the legal structures, we get to the business structure. Social purpose organization is something, a term that's been used to define for-profit structures that act like social enterprises. And then further along the continuum, we have responsible businesses. They're generated for profit to maximize shareholders' wealth, but at the end of the day, they are also trying to do good as part of their corporate strategy. And then at the very end of the continuum, we have capitalistic businesses and structures, which is simply pure capitalism. It's to driving a profit for the stakeholders and the shareholders only. And so when we have a continuum that includes both nonprofit and for-profit structures, where do we draw the line? How do we actually define what a structure of a social enterprise is? We can put a box around something all day long. But at this point, we're just going to have to be content that when we talk about social enterprises, we are talking about both nonprofits and charities that are employing business methods and for-profit entities that have a social purpose in mind and are organized around a social purpose. So what can we agree upon today? We can agree that social enterprises on both sides of the legal structure are mission first. The reason for the existence is primarily a public good at the end of the day. They employ business methods. They employ market-based approaches to serve a mission, both on a nonprofit and for-profit side. The revenue is reinvested. Some of the profits or surplus, depending on what side of the coin you're on, are reinvested into the mission. How much, what does that look like, is an arbitrary number at this point. They have measurable impact, reasonably understood when they're advancing the mission. They're reasonably able to measure whether or not they're achieving why they exist or not. And then finally, sustainability. They're able to meet their financial obligations, which is one of the basic business principles of ensuring that your venture is a going concern. Is it able to meet its liabilities at the end of the day? Is it able to meet its financial obligations? So when we think about social enterprise, let's think about it in this context. Let's have some generally agreed upon terms, and then we can move forward, because we could spend the next 2 hours defining a social enterprise. So I'm going to move into what social enterprise structures can potentially look like. And a lot of the content you're going to find in this presentation is really based on learned experiences, learning as we kind of go, and trying to understand and wrap definitions around how do you structure a social enterprise, or how do you structure an entity that's trying to do good at the end of the day. So before we get into that, we need to set the stage. When we think about legal entities, we know there's a number of entities that are out there. We know what a nonprofit is. A nonprofit is an organization created without share capital. That's what a nonprofit is. It is mission driven. And typically nonprofits reinvest any and all surpluses, all the revenues, into their purpose at the end of the day. A charity is a nonprofit that is legally registered for charitable purposes. CRA guidelines define 4 areas for a charitable good, and a charity has the added benefit of being able to write charitable receipts, donations. You can actually write receipts for donations. It requires a little bit more on the accounting side and the disclosure side, but by and large, those are your 2 main nonprofit structures. Let's talk about cooperatives. Cooperatives are also a legal entity and structure that partake in social enterprise. Cooperatives can be both nonprofit and for-profit, but the delineator between those 2 is that they're member-owned organizations. One reinvests into its purpose, so it's a group of people who reinvest into a social purpose, or if it's for-profit, the members share the profit. And then at the end of the day, we have a for-profit, which is a business maximizing shareholders' profits at the end of the day. These are the legal structures. So I want you to keep this in mind as we think about what container we're going to put these into as social enterprises. So this has been a little bit of a fiddling. And the challenge with fiddling is because there's no defined way to create a corporate structure for a social enterprise. So we need to take our existing structures that currently work in legislation and CRA and decide how are they going to be structured together? How are they going to relate to one another? So if we take the intention of a social enterprise and we put it in with or alongside an organization that has one of these legal structures, we need to understand how that looks. So in this particular grid, what I've done is I've separated out these potential structures based on the level of influence you have over your social enterprise, or how integrated those social enterprises are into your organization. Again, when I talk about organization, I'm referring to charities, nonprofits, cooperatives, and for-profits. So diving into it, and we look at the internal inside your organization, there's 2 generally approachable ways to organize your social enterprise. It's otherwise you create your social enterprise as a separate operation inside of your organization, or the organization and the social enterprise are synonymous. They are one and the same. So we call this, for the sake of the lack of terminology, compartmentalized or embedded. A compartmentalized social enterprise operates alongside programs of a charity or a nonprofit, or a nonprofit cooperative. And the reason why we compartmentalize is for a number of things. 1, to separate out financial and accounting so that you know what revenues and what expenditures look like for that social enterprise. It also delineates different management control. It puts new structures in place to oversee and manage that particular social enterprise. And by compartmentalizing, you are safeguarding your organization in the future in case there is a loss of funding or a loss of revenue on one side or the other. On the embedded side, this is simply a social enterprise that is the organization. There's really no difference between what the social enterprise is or the organization is. There's no separation of the social enterprise from the organization itself. So it's embedded. And as you can imagine, embedded is more integrated into your organization. Then we look when a social enterprise is then created external to your organization. Well, one way of doing it is to think about it in terms of tethers. Is there a line connecting that social enterprise to your organization? So in Tethered, the social enterprise is a separate entity controlled by an organization. Controlled is going to be very important moving forward as we continue to go through what is and what isn't and how we can structure a social enterprise. But it's tethered as in tethered by a link or a chain. On the other side, aligned. You may have a social enterprise that's created alongside an organization, but there is no formal ties. There is no control of that entity. So it's a separate entity with strategic ties only. The best way that we can get into understanding what these different parts is to visualize and provide examples. So when we think about what embedded could look like, the organization and the social enterprise are one and the same. They are one organization. There's no delineation or difference. When we think about compartmentalized, think about the organization as the holder of the social enterprise, and the social enterprise is a division or a department or a compartment or a program of that organization. So let's take some examples. After we go into Tethered, of course. Tethered, there's a couple different ways we can do this. Otherwise, there's a parent and sub relationship where the organization is the parent to the social enterprise. This is where you have control over the social enterprise. The other is an indirect way where an intermediary is created between the organization and the social enterprise because we need an intermediary due to regulations from CRA and legislation and otherwise. I'll get into details of this in a bit. And then aligned, there's no control, hence the dotted line, but they have relationships from a strategic perspective. It may be a management agreement, it may be a contract, it may be a partnership, but there's some alignment between them, and there might even be resource sharing between. So let's go back to embedded and compartmentalized. Embedded, it's within the organization. The organization is the social enterprise. Compartmentalized, it's a portion thereof. So one example, and in my nearly decade plus in this world, I was actually surprised to understand Island Furniture is a social enterprise. First I understood Island Furniture was when I needed a new couch and didn't realize that it had a social purpose. Island Furniture was actually created in '79 with a mission to deploy developmentally delayed individuals in real jobs in furniture manufacturing. That then evolved into a retail outlet, again, employing clients throughout their operations. And over the last 25 years, they've actually dispersed over 8 million and supported 1,800 job placements for their clients all throughout the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Recently, Island Furniture has recently expanded into Island Office with the same mission. We don't think about a furniture retail outlet as a social enterprise, but the fact that we even didn't understand it was, and it comes as a surprise to many, shows that a social enterprise and the organization, when they are embedded, they are synonymous with one and each other. So let's talk about compartmentalized. And I think this person might be on the call today. Amy, give me a little emotion. If you're on, Amy's on, perfect, fantastic. Amy, please feel free to correct me if anything I say is incorrect or wrong on this one. Compartmentalized example is Home Again Furniture Bank. And this is based on my reading of their website and their materials. But essentially, Home Again Furniture Bank is a nonprofit charitable organization that provides gently used furniture to individuals and families in need. So as Amy's on the call. As Amy and the team, we're trying to understand how to diversify the revenue, how to sustain their operations. They realized that a number of the pieces of furniture and a number of decor items they were receiving could find a new life and a second home and potential for social enterprise and value generation. And so while some of the donations go back to the to Home Again Furniture Bank as our province's furniture bank, a number of pieces you'll find at Again and Again boutique, where they upcycle, repair, and then resell. Those proceeds then go back into the organization and back into their charitable mission at the end of the day. What's really neat is that, and this is important for later as well, they employ volunteers in their retail outlet. So there's volunteers working in the social enterprise itself, and they have volunteer coordinators. If you notice, they maintain a separate brand, linked but separate. Home Again Furniture Bank, and then again and again. Websites have a delineation, there's a connection point, but there's an integrated management in place. The executive director for one is the executive director for the other, board for one, board for other. And so with this compartmentalized example, we have a social enterprise entity that exists within the legal structure of the organization. It is generating revenue because it found a repeatable business model where it can repair gently used furniture and decor and then resell for a margin. And then again and again is able to benefit from having a stream of furniture coming in to support its charitable mission. And then on the other side, the revenues generated from again and again in order to support the operations of the venture. And those two are linked. They're within the same organization, but then they're separated for marketing, management, and accounting purposes. I'm going to take a quick pause there, and we actually have the executive director for Home Again Furniture Bank, Amy Tolk here. Amy, I don't want to put you on the spot. I will, because you know I usually do. I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you be interested in taking a few minutes and talking about the rationale as to why you created Again and Again, and how does Again and Again serve Home Again Furniture Bank? Do you terribly mind?
Not at all. No, that's okay. Yeah, I think you did a great job explaining. The only thing that I would mention is that we do have volunteers at our store, but we also have employed folks. So when we first started, we partnered with another social enterprise that had an employment program. And the agreement was that we would be another offering for their social enterprises through their employment program. So when we first opened, we didn't have any paid employees. They were all through volunteers or through the partnership with was Choices for Youth, actually. And so since then, we've been able to hire 3 of the youth that went through the program. So it's that's another added bonus that I would say is becoming quickly a part of our values and our core, is to offer employment to folks that are facing barriers. So, I mean, I think you said most of it, Colin. The only thing that I would say is that COVID is one of the reasons why we were able to kind of take a minute and look at how we needed to diversify our revenue. It was scary times for everyone, but for us, we completely shut down because we were solely, our operations relied heavily on volunteers. So we needed to change our operations. We had to start hiring moving companies to help us with the furniture delivery so that folks could have the items they need to live comfortably. And in order to do that, we had to increase our revenue. I think we all know that you can't rely on funding solely, and fundraising environment has been a challenge for the last few years. And so we decided to, it started as a pop-up. We were going to do a little pop-up for 6 or 8 weeks over the summer. And then it evolved into a pilot. And because we couldn't find the space, it took a long time to find the space. But once we opened, it proved to be very successful, and we just decided to keep the doors opened, and we're going into our 3rd year.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amy. Congratulations to you, the team. And also a little plug, where's your current retail location, Amy?
We're at 25 Hebron Way, so just up across from the new Canadian Tire store and right next door to Winging It. Beautiful little boutique. Colin called it a boutique thrift store. We've been doing very well there, and we've created lots of different programming inside the store. And we're actually going to be having an employment program starting sometime in March, our first ever on our own employment program. So we're super excited.
Fantastic. Congratulations to you good folks.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to purposely do this from now on if I ever do these presentations. I swear I didn't plant Amy into the conversation, but that was beautiful, Amy. And so folks, if you are in the metro area and you're a little bit hungry, but you're also on the hunt for some decor and furniture items, head up to Hebron Way. You can grab some wings, you can grab a wing-backed chair. There is no better way to spend an afternoon. Thank you again, Amy. So folks, that is the embedded and the compartmentalized examples. And so what we really need to kind of think about is when social enterprise exists internal to the organization, we have to remember that a number of these entities are charities and nonprofits. And there are restrictions in place on what you can and cannot do as a charity and as a nonprofit, particularly as a charity. So what I would like to remind people is remember when you are structuring a social enterprise that is within your organization, you must remember that any social enterprise in a charity must be a related business. So what is a related business? CRA defines this two ways. Directly advances a charity's mission. And so if we go back to Home Again Furniture Bank, again and again, being able to upcycle and resell furniture, be able to, as a employment support program as well, be able to employ clients in that retail outlet as well. I would say that is directly advancing the charity's mission at the end of the day. On the other side, operated substantially or by volunteers. I'll get into 90% in a second. That's why I thought this was a really neat example, is because while Home Again Furniture Bank and again started by employing volunteers in a retail outlet, this actually helped to ensure that it was a related business. Do you need both of these in order to be a related business? Not necessarily. One or the other works for CRA's perspective. It's best to have two if possible. So let's talk about 90%. CRA doesn't actually tell us what substantially means for volunteers. However, testing this number and testing this threshold, CRA has typically stuck to around 90% as a threshold value if it's operated substantially by volunteers. And not just on the ground floor, but also in operations and management functions as well. Now, any social enterprise in a nonprofit must align with the mission and not exist solely to generate profit. Whether you are a nonprofit, if you are a nonprofit, you must ensure that the social enterprise that you are operating doesn't exist solely to generate profit. It is not, as much as we want to hope for it to be. You can't just simply purchase a business or start a social enterprise just to bring in diversified revenue to your organization. There must be an alignment or a link with your mission. Again, CRA does not provide concrete examples or concrete ways of alignment. So we go back to mission and we go back to intention. If you are a furniture bank starting a thrift boutique, makes you aligned. If you are manufacturing furniture and to employ at-risk individuals, starting a retail outlet to employ those clients throughout the operations, that's aligned. That makes a lot of sense. If you're in the food security space, being able to open a cafe at lower than market or lower cost products, that relates. That is aligned with your mission at the end of the day. If you're alleviating poverty and your focus is alleviating poverty, then any measures or any employment that can reduce the costs for the general public, particularly those living at or below the poverty line, or provide economic security, sustainability for those individuals, vis-a-vis employment, that aligns as nonprofit. As a social enterprise, as a charity, you must adhere to a related business. It's more structured as a charity. And the reason why it's more structured as a charity, charities are more regulated because they can provide donation receipts. So for both nonprofits and charities, revenues must be reinvested in the mission and cannot be distributed or enrich directors, stakeholders, board members. This is incredibly important. For both charities and nonprofits, you must reinvest it in the mission. Again, what does that threshold look like? We don't have a clear sight on it, but it cannot be distributed or enriched to the stakeholders and board members, particularly if we're dealing with for-profit social enterprises. We need to be mindful that there's a conflict of interest that arises from there, and we need to be mindful about ownership matters. You must report on business activities and account for separately from your mission activities. A good rule of thumb for both is that if you are running a social enterprise, and even if it's embedded within your organization, if there is if you have a charitable intent or if you have a mission as a nonprofit, ensure that you're accounting for the business activities separately. Create a separate department, separate account, separate sheet, and in some instances, separate bank account. Also helps to ensure that you're keeping it separately, you're thinking about the separation from your mission activities. And then generate substantial revenue may require reclassification. And by I mean reclassification, I mean CRA reclassification. There is a risk as charities and nonprofits operating as social enterprises is that CRA may assess your charity and nonprofit and potentially revoke your status, or worse, reclassify you as a for-profit entity and look to retroactively make that happen. We don't have a lot of instances in case law to support what substantial revenue means. And so when we think about it, I go back to the 2012 ruling of a service club and organization that was operating a event venue, so food and alcohol services. And at that point in time, CRA assessed that they were substantially generating revenue beyond the reason why that organization was created to begin with. And so that's the risk. So being able to document your purpose, being able to document how your business activity aligns with your mandate, your mission at the end of the day, is incredibly important as you think about structuring your social enterprise internally. So what happens if the social enterprise is not inside of your organization? How do we structure that social enterprise? What if the social enterprise is a for-profit entity? What if the organization is a for-profit entity? On the other side, what if the social enterprise is not aligned with the mission, is not aligned with charitable purpose? Here we have tethering. In Canada, nonprofits can wholly own social enterprises. There are some restrictions around what that social enterprise does. It needs to be aligned, but this is a loose definition. But at the core, nonprofits can own for-profit entities. Let that sink in for a second. Nonprofits can be parent companies to for-profit entities. Those for-profit entities must have their own records, they must be accounted for separately, and they must pay corporate taxation. But as a nonprofit structure, you can own a for-profit, 100%. There's some give and take. On the other side, charities cannot wholly own for-profit entities. This is an important delineation. Charities can own a percentage or a portion of a for-profit entity, vis-a-vis shares or whatnot, but they can't own a majority or 50% plus one. They can't have what's called control. So the challenge, if the charity is the organization and you want to acquire or start a for-profit social enterprise, how do you do that? Indirectly, you can tether it through an intermediary. One of the strategies you can employ is the creation of a nonprofit entity, an intermediary, who can wholly own a for-profit entity, the social enterprise. And then, of course, that intermediary, the nonprofit, can provide grants and funds back to your charitable organization. That's getting a little bit complicated. So I'm going to get into a couple of examples and work this out as we go along. Then I'll get into what aligned means for us. So nonprofit charity ownership. A nonprofit can wholly own a for-profit, just like I said, it's aligned. A charity can own part of the for-profit but cannot control. So control is dictated by 50%, unless it is a related business. And how do we get to a related business in charities? It directly advances the mission or is 90% volunteer run. That's how a charity can own a for-profit entity, a for-profit social enterprise. This is fairly rare to see. For-profits pays corporate taxes and provides donations or dividends to the nonprofit or charity. So in a structure where a nonprofit or a charity owns, otherwise in part or through an intermediary, a for-profit entity, that for-profit is still required to carry on as a business corporation in Canada. It still needs to pay its corporate taxes. And whatever profit or if dividends are declared, can take and then funnel into the nonprofit or the charity. The for-profit must have separate operations. This is where, particularly in a startup perspective, we sometimes falter. It must have separate operations, finance, and independence of management from the charity or the nonprofit, which means that you have to have a separate governance structure. It cannot be the same individuals managing and operating charity's nonprofit who is managing and operating the for-profit corporation. There needs to be a more than an arm's length separation. And also, when we're thinking about how this tethered relationship works, there can be back and forth in terms of resource sharing or purchasing of goods and services, but the for-profit cannot be subsidized by the nonprofit or the charity. This means that the wages, the operations, it cannot be the cost of the nonprofit. Because at the end of the day, nonprofits and charities are organized for a purpose. If you are supporting subsidizing a for-profit venture, then with your your building or your land or your assets or your bank account, you can't do it. You can't directly subsidize. So we're very clear about where the boxes are and where the boxes need to be in a tethered relationship. But what if the business was unrelated? What if the social enterprise, the for-profit, is unrelated to the charity? And that's where we get back into creating the intermediary, a connected nonprofit that connects the charity to a nonprofit who can wholly own the social enterprise. So the nonprofit in this example wholly owns the for-profit, with some of the examples I provided above, and the for-profit provides grant certificates to the nonprofit. So how does it work? How do we get the flow of capital and cash from a nonprofit to a charity, if it is indeed a charity carrying on an unrelated social enterprise? There's a number of rules that we need to be aware of. There are limitations. A nonprofit cannot be provided with a tax receipt for their donation. And donations to the charity must align with the nonprofit purpose. So we can't simply just create a holding company and then flow through the cash and hope for the best. That nonprofit needs to have its own independent purpose, its own mission that aligns with your charitable mission at the end of the day. We cannot solely fund the charity. It must have other activities. If the nonprofit is seen as a complete flow through and it's only existing just to funnel funds to that charity, then it can be deemed ineligible. So that nonprofit, that intermediary that we've created, they must have other activity. So we'll go back to one of our examples, say food security. We have a charity that advances food security, and it wanted to buy a consulting company, for lack of a better example. There's not a clear linkage between that charity and the consulting company. However, if a nonprofit was created to be a data warehouse for food security and do research on food security, there's a relation right there. They have a related and aligned purpose. Donations then can move from the nonprofit to the charity. And on the nonprofit side, it becomes an expense to the nonprofit. You can't just take funds off the balance sheet of a nonprofit and divert it over to a charity. It must be recognized as an expense one way or another. So what happens if all else fails? And all else fails as a number of scenarios. One, the cost of setting up any new structures becomes too burdensome for a startup, nonprofit charity social enterprise. We have a conversation, an honest conversation with our boards of directors who are more risk adverse to setting up additional structures. Maybe we do not have the management, the oversight, and skills and experience needed to set up another entity. So in that case, we go back to aligning. And that is where the organization and the social enterprise do not have a ownership structure in one another. Instead, they align their efforts. So this looks like a number of ways. One, it helps us avoid regulatory issues due to ownership models. So if we're having that conversation of if a social enterprise and that nonprofit is aligned with that charity and we're not clear, then you can avoid those regulatory issues and change to a different model alignment. So a couple alignments can happen fairly easily. You could have a sponsorship. This is where a social enterprise, for profit, and a charity or nonprofit engage in an agreement where a certain percentage, you can do a revenue sharing, certain percentage of the revenues goes to that charity, and you follow the normal course. You could have an agreement, partnership agreement, where you exchange management services. It could be that that for-profit is providing value to that nonprofit, and that nonprofit is providing value to that for-profit social enterprise. You could also have contracted services. You can have an agreement in place that the nonprofit provides a service to the for-profit, or the for-profit provides a service to a nonprofit. Imagine the normal ways in which separate entities in the business world engage with each other. That's a way that you can align either or more. The challenge here is to make sure that you're maintaining separate organizations. If your board of directors of your charity nonprofit are the directors of the for-profit social enterprise, that's not a separate organization. That would denote control, or that would assume control at the end of the day. And mark transactions at fair value. When we're thinking about the number of interactions between charities, nonprofits, and for-profits in the social enterprise sphere, we need to make sure that we're not selling a service or providing a service or receiving a service or goods that are below a market value, below what you would sell on the market for. That denotes that there's an imbalance, an unfairness happening. So as a nonprofit, you can't provide management services for $1 for a for-profit. That would suggest that the for-profit is able to maximize its profit better because it's not spending as much of expenditure at the not so benefit of a nonprofit. So when all else fails, think about alignment. Think about the relationships you can have between those different legal entities. So what did I cover? A whole lot in a very short period of time. And so before I get into creative strategies, I just want to go back and give ourselves a reminder of what this looks like as an organization. You can have an organization that is a social enterprise. It could be a nonprofit, it could be a charity, it could be a cooperative, various forms, it could be a for-profit embedded. Compartmentalize is when you take your social enterprise activities and you compartmentalize it. In a nonprofit, charitable, and nonprofit cooperative model, that is a separate accounting, as a separate entity, separate management, and staff involved. And you're running other things as well. The same with a for-profit structure. The social enterprise is just for-profit. That's when it's inside of an organization. The social enterprise reflects the entity in which it's held under. Where it gets fun is when you start mixing and matching different corporate structures. An organization, a nonprofit or a charity, can, asterisk, own a for-profit social enterprise, should it be a for-profit social enterprise. Nonprofits can fully own. Charities, there's a lot more limitations. So that's why we have the opportunity to create an intermediary. If the organization is a charity, the intermediary can be a nonprofit and wholly own social enterprise. And then if through otherwise risk, through tolerance, through misalignment of mission, or because the structure is becoming too complex or too expensive, you can always align those two organizations together. So I'm coming to the point, I'm just going to check the time very quickly. Ooh, do we have time? I'm going to check the time really quickly, bunch myself about an hour. I want to talk about a couple of the creative strategies that we can employ as social entrepreneurs, as charities and nonprofits, as for-profit social entrepreneurs around how to manage your structure as a social enterprise. So one of the opportunities that we have is in mergers and acquisitions in social enterprises. Why create something brand new when you can acquire? And this goes for both nonprofit and for-profit structures. Why would you identify a for-profit or even another nonprofit to acquire and bring into your organization and run as a social enterprise? Collectively, you notionally reduce overhead costs and operating expenditures by merging with another entity or acquiring another entity. It's also an avenue to create new social enterprise structures, particularly if you're acquiring a for-profit entity. And this is where I make a wonderful plug for some of the great work happening at CSCNL. Some of you know that over the last year, we've launched the Social Enterprise Through Acquisition program. The goal of this program is to match nonprofit buyers with for-profit sellers. It comes down to the challenge that we have here in Newfoundland, Labrador. Our for-profit businesses, particularly in rural Newfoundland, Labrador, that are viable, have a going concern, their owners are retiring, and their succession plan is unclear sometimes. We also have nonprofits and charities that are looking to diversify the revenue they're bringing into their organizations. And so we decided to match those buyers and those sellers together and put them through a supported program that we're calling CETA. If you are interested in the CETA program, please check the link that Andre has popped into the chat there. And if you have any questions about potentially buying a for-profit venture, or if you know a for-profit venture that's for sale who hasn't considered social succession planning yet, please get in touch with Andre, our freshly minted, about a month and a bit, senior associate for social ventures. For those in the room, there's some literature here, and you can find more on the site there. Mergers and acquisitions work for profits, it also works for nonprofits as well. I'll tell a personal story. When I was working at Genesis, a tech incubation hub here in Newfoundland, Labrador, we were struggling with space. We needed additional space in order to house the growing portfolio of ventures that we had. And so we approached and had a conversation with the former Common Ground Co-working, which was a co-working site operating in downtown St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador. And we started discussing what would a potential merger look like. They were challenged by the operations and keeping the operations of a co-working site going, and we needed more space. So we had a conversation, and this is typically where a lot of these conversations and M&As and in social enterprise starts with a coffee chat. What is your aims? What are you trying to achieve? We decided to meld both tech entrepreneurship and general entrepreneurship together and relaunch Common Ground Co-working as Genesis Co-working. We acquired their assets and we began operating. There's a way, if we're thoughtful, if we start the conversation, there's a way that we can do mergers and acquisitions in our wider sector. So if you are a nonprofit or a charity, the number one, and some of you online may have heard me say this before, the number one tool in your toolbox is creating restricted reserves. What happens if you think you're going to run the risk of being reclassified as a for-profit? What happens when and I hope this happens, your social enterprise, be it for-profit or nonprofit structure, is wildly successful, bringing in new unrestricted funds into your organization? The challenge is that we don't necessarily want to hit that threshold of being assessed as a profit generating, or only being organized for profit entity, and lose our nonprofit or our charitable status. One of the opportunities we have at the board level is create something called a restricted reserve. These are generally created by virtue of a resolution of the board of directors. And the restricted reserve, is created around the intent and aligned with the intent of the organization, the charity or nonprofit, and it designates a certain percentage or amount of profits or dividends or windfalls from your social enterprise into said reserve. It essentially predetermines, again, with intent, where the funds for that where funds from that profit generating entity is going to go in your charity or nonprofit. And so then when your organization, hopefully never, is assessed by CRA or another entity, you can point to your restricted reserve. We didn't intend to generate profit. That wasn't our intention. Yes, we were super successful in doing so. And because of that, in advance, we have created this restricted reserve. Typically, restricted reserves are created for rainy day accounts, for the operations of your charity nonprofit. They're created around future growth of programs and opportunities you can tap into, or they're structured in such a way for a particular asset, like a piece of capital that you need for your charitable or nonprofit mission at the end of the day. Reserves, by and large, are a great tool if you're able to create them within an organization. They help support long-term financial sustainability. And it also helps with board buy-in, particularly if we're having our conversation with our governance structures about buying, acquiring, setting up an intermediary, ensuring the thoughtfulness has been put into where are the surplus revenues going to go as an entity, helps a lot with that conversation, particularly with the board. Also, it allows for capital for future growth initiatives and rainy days. We'll go to Amy's example, employment program. If Amy at Home Again Furniture Bank needed a certain set of capital in order to grow into employment support programs, a restricted reserve set up with the windfalls from the venture going into it allows for capital to be able to support those growth. The other side is rainy days. You all have experienced that rainy day in March of 2020, in which reserves were an incredibly important piece of our financial toolkit for charities and nonprofits. When you're creating reserves, it's not simply enough to just say, we're going to create a reserve. Work with your friendly neighborhood auditor and CPA, work with your board in particular to properly document, add policy around, and enshrine those restricted reserves in your financial statements. It is very difficult in, let's say, arbitrarily 10 years' time, when you are incredibly successful as a social entrepreneur and your social enterprises are producing even more revenue than anticipated. Looking back to 10 years prior, when you put this reserve in place, you'll be thankful that you put one more tool in your financial toolkit, because at the end of the day, the assessment of if it's for-profit generating comes down to intention. Did you intend to generate revenue? This suggests that you didn't. You're intending to set up your organization for success aligned with the mission. So the last piece that I have is a little bit of throw out to how do we, because there is no structure of a social enterprise, we can say we are social enterprises, but what does that mean in the public sphere? One of the toolkits we can put in our toolbox actually comes from a set of toolboxes right across the country and internationally. One piece that we might want to think about is how do we create trust? Simply saying we are a social enterprise when we don't have a clear definition or a legal structure that can delineate a social enterprise, how do we say that we are adhering to some level of standards? There is a number of certifications out there that you can leverage and you can explore if it makes sense for your particular enterprise. People and Planet First is an international certification that ensures that nonprofit and for-profit in particular entities are putting people and planet and social causes first. They are mission aligned, they are reinvesting their profits, and there is a set of criteria in order to achieve this certification. Very similar to Buy Social Canada. Buy Social Canada is a certification for social enterprises that are selling goods and services for both for-profit and nonprofit structures, in which it goes through again a process to understand: are you adhering to your mission? Are you ensuring that profits are reinvested? Very similar to the others. You may have heard of B Corp certification before, particularly for for-profit corporations. B Corp or certified as a B Corp suggests that you have undergone a rigorous set of criteria that understands and acknowledges that your for-profit corporation is there to do well, good, and is organized for a social purpose. As a for-profit, about a B Corp certification, that's another indication to the general public that you're thinking about your mission and thinking about your purpose at the end of the day. In Canada, we also have a Magic Canada accredited. This is for the governance side of the structures. An accredited charity or nonprofit with a Magic Canada, again, rigorous set of standards around your operations, your governance structures, your growth and your sustainability as an organization, and you can become accredited with Magic Canada, which then supports and aids in conversations around governance of your organizations and how you manage yourself as a charity or nonprofit. And then again, because this has come up in media and my news feeds are filled with this little yellow sticker, if you are a product in Newfoundland and Labrador, there is an opportunity to add this little yellow sticker. But for those of us who remember the Made Right Here ones, very much a throwback to that, buy from Newfoundland and Labrador, which means that at the end of the day, even if you're not organized for a particular purpose, you're thinking about local economies, you're thinking about reinvesting in locals as well. Those are a number of certifications that you can explore among many others to build trust for your social enterprise. So between mergers and acquisitions, restricted reserves, and certifications for trust building, those are some strategies among many that you can employ, add to your toolkits to support your social enterprises. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Colin. It was a great presentation. Perhaps now I'll pass the time to Andre to start our Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Colin. That was fantastic. Any questions from folks? Feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. I'll pause for a minute.
Anticipating question, I will provide a copy of the presentation so people can go through and use as they need to, with a big asterisk. This is provided for information purposes only, and I highly encourage you as you explore these conversations, explore them with a CPA, your friendly neighborhood accountant, or your favorite lawyer as well. Favorite lawyer.
Awesome. Looks like it was pretty thorough, Colin. Lots of folks, some comments here. Great presentation. Thank you for the information. Super informative. Appreciate it, everybody.
Perhaps I could start a question. You mentioned about the partnership agreements as an alternative. Do you see that a more accessible way in terms of tax reporting?
Oh, absolutely. Question was around the alignment and creating the contract and relationship or agreement between two entities as a more approachable way. And absolutely. One, it takes the conversation about legal entity and whether or not you need to think about the taxable entity and whether you need to think about sharing the purpose. It takes that conversation and lays it aside for a moment and focuses on the opportunity for two separate legal structures to work together towards a common social purpose at the end of the day. Typically, you would think about otherwise entering into a simple business contract or agreement, so there'd be some legal involved to paper that agreement. But typically it's a little bit more flexible and it shows up separately in each organization.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And Ian has a comment here. Thank you for the presentation. Good morning, Colin. This is Ian from MUN. I'm looking for a public engagement partnership with off-campus individuals or organizations on recycling materials and remaking arts for a potential social enterprise. Ian, is the partnership specifically for engagement, or are you looking for a partner? Could you maybe come off mute and tell us a bit more?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Of course, it's amazing, and I learned so much. And I'm planning on like creating or building a social enterprise on how to recycling materials from the labs from university and remake them into art so we can sell them into the local community. And of course, with the mission of empower the background of the lab or to invoke the community, the sense of community for those different projects running within the labs, because there are a lot of projects they are running within the university, but I'm trying to bring the story from the labs into the community. So that's kind of the mission of the social enterprise. So I'm looking for partnership. So I just left that comments here.
Fantastic. Ian, there's a number of organizations that can help advance that conversation. Business and Arts NL is a natural combination between the creative sector and the business sector as well. A conversation with local university around what their requirements are for disposal of pieces of equipment or pieces from the lab is a definite, but the pathway for that sounds like the sustainability office here on campus. And think about and have a look for other organizations that are out there that are looking to create art out of something so intentional as a story that's coming out from a laboratory. One that pops to mind immediately, particularly if glass is involved, is a cooperative, a cooperative called Newfoundland Glass, I think it is. And they actually take recycled glass. They turn it into a sand mixture, so down to its basic elements, so it can be recycled, but then that sand can then be processed into artistic pieces as well. So between all of those pieces, there's a couple points that I would try to point your way. And if you're looking for funding for something to divert physical waste from the landfill, the Multi-Material Stewardship Board has an annual innovation call. I'd keep an eye on that.
Thank you so much for the suggestions.
Thank you. Good to hear from you.
All right, and we've had a few more come in. Thanks, Brendan says, thanks for the presentation. If the topic is dry, we wouldn't have realized. Would you have any advice for a registered charity operating at a national scale that's exploring social enterprise for creating more financial sustainability, perhaps a compartmentalized model?
Definitely. It would come down to where the social enterprise will be operating. So if it's a national charity operating a social enterprise, is it localized in a particular jurisdiction? If that's the case, it might make sense for that national charity to register as an extra-provincial organization in the province, territory, or a number of provinces and territories, so it can officially begin its operations. If the social enterprise is something more remote or indirect or national in scope, think about corporate structures from a federal perspective instead of a provincial perspective. That'll be my first kind of thought. The other aspect of that is if you're thinking about a national charity, start a social enterprise, are there viable business models that are currently operating anywhere in Canada that would make sense, would align with the mission of the charity? And if not aligned with the mission of the charity, depending on what that opportunity looks like, think about creating a separate nonprofit entity. As I mentioned in the aligned as a intermediary that exists in the province and territories in which that business or that venture is operating. So when I'm thinking about the structuring kind of conversation, that's what immediately jumps to mind. My recommendation to anybody, sans geography, is think about what the form you want something to take, and then understand the actual, the function of what you want, then understand what that form looks like afterwards. So you're building something after you've thought it out, and not just kind of jumping into creating something and then figuring it out later. You do have a bit of time to figure out what that looks like.
Great. Brennan's just clarified he's currently registered in Alberta. I don't know if that changed this your recommendations, Colin.
So sounds like a coffee chat at some point in time if we ever cross paths again. But if it's currently registered in Alberta, if it's a provincial organization and you're looking at national level work, you would have to register that entity nationally to think about or take the benefit from doing that. If you're planning on doing work in other provinces and territories, you would have to register each of those provinces and territories in which you're actually doing work on the ground. And think about what your national structure might look like. Is the charity in Alberta the one who holds and owns the social enterprises, be them for-profit or non-profit? What does that structure look like? And think about some models that are already out there in terms of a little bit in the franchising side, but also when there are provincial or territorial arms of existing national organizations. Because you can think about it that way and then work backwards. But happy to have another chat about it.
All right. Do we have time for one more?
Absolutely.
All right. We have a couple comments from Kelly Jane Bruton. I'm looking for producers in a zero waste cod project for the Women's Fishing and Cultural Cooperative. We are a sister organization of Fishing for Success. I've learned a lot about the governance issues of having two boards. The overlapping of board members may cause a tangle. I don't know if there's any advice or insights you could share, Colin.
Absolutely. So it depends on the cooperative, how it's structured. If it's a nonprofit cooperative, we might want to think about, is there a certain percentage of the nonprofit board? I think it says for-profit. Okay, fantastic. If it is a for-profit cooperative, you might want to think about who the members are. The board, the employees of the nonprofit can absolutely be members of that cooperative, the for-profit cooperative, but this is where we get into a conversation around control. We, for the simplicity of this presentation, talk about control as in ownership, 50% or more, but if you can also have control by virtue of decision-making, there we go, that control. So if it feels like the for-profit is being controlled by the nonprofit vis-a-vis the governance structure, there might need to be an honest conversation about how you bridge the alignment of the mission, but with the understanding that there is no control between either organization. In this particular instance, you might want to think about, does the nonprofit fully own the for-profit cooperative, which would be difficult with the cooperative model, or is it aligned? Is there an alignment between those? And then very clearly document what the connection points are, including governance structure. There's nothing prohibiting a nonprofit board director being a director of a corporation. You just need to be mindful that when we get to more than 50%, board will be fantastic. When we get more than 50%, or it seems to be that the nonprofit is controlling the for-profit, I go back to the presentation and walk through. And again, reach out, happy to have a conversation about it.
All right. We have one more just come in from Alberto. Hey, Colin, what advice would you give to recruit volunteers for a social enterprise? What's a good way to pitch the idea and retain talent without financial incentives?
If you can solve this problem, we've solved the problem for a lot of charities and nonprofits across this country. My recommendation always is to be upfront and honest with volunteers. What are they actually contributing to? Are they contributing to a for-profit entity that is owned or is controlled by a nonprofit entity? Or are they contributing to a for-profit that's completely separated from and not tethered to a nonprofit or a charity? It usually starts with that conversation. A really good example of how this works in practice is, again, I go to the reselling market with Habitat for Humanity and the Restore. Habitat for Humanity employs both paid employees and volunteers in the operations of their Restore, in which they generate an income or a profit to reinvest back into building homes for at-risk and at-risk populations and families. And so they're very clear about what the expectations of a volunteer is, versus the expectations of a paid staff who may be in that venture. And that comes down to scheduling, shifts, who to report to. My go-to when you're recruiting volunteers is start with why. Why do you exist? If your why statement as an entity, as an organization matches with the passion of that volunteer, you've already won them over in terms of being involved in your purpose. The next go-to is transparency. How are you operated? How are you governed? Are you managed? And then the third goes down to what will that volunteer actually do? What is required of them that cannot be found through paid or through paid employment? And being very clear what that looks like. The really simple tool you can use in this instance is sit down and draw up a job description for that volunteer. It includes who the entity is, it includes reporting relationships, duties and responsibilities, and what expectations are. Take it from that perspective, and you'll be able to find a little bit more ease in finding volunteers that are aligned with your mission and purpose because they're passionate about it, aligned with your operations because they have full expectations and understand what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day.
If I can add to that as well, once you have that posting that Colin mentioned, some job boards have specifically volunteering options. Good Work is one. I just put a link there. I would also encourage you, if you haven't already, reached out to student organizations. There's a lot of folks that are looking to graduate and are looking for work experience, and volunteering experience is a good way to pad the resume, and they might be interested in getting involved.
That's a fantastic question.
Perfect. I will just do a quick wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Colin, for coming in, delivering a really excellent presentation. And so willing to share all the information, knowledge with the community, which is amazing. Again, we have the next sessions happening in March. The invites and the guest speakers are going to be shared soon, so stay tuned with our Community Sector Council NL, our Social Innovation Lab, and our communication channels. Information will also be posted in our Center for Social Enterprise social media. Thank you so much for coming in. If there's any final questions, we are happy to take in, but if not, we will just call it a quick meeting, and then we will just give 15 minutes back to all the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.